Hi guys, in today's video I'm going to show you how to do the technique of shirring with elastic thread. Now don't be intimidated, this is actually really easy to do. So once you understand how it works on your machine, how to hand wind the bobbin and get the tension set correctly, I think you'll get pretty comfortable at using this technique in a variety of projects that you have. So let's jump on in and get started. The supplies that you're going to need are elastic thread, an empty bobbin, the fabric that you would like to do the technique on, and then you're going to want to have an ironing board, and a spray bottle. And of course, scissors, sewing machine are essential as well. Elastic thread comes on a spool. It's very narrow and it's very stretchy. So it's a little bit thicker than a standard sewing machine all-purpose thread, but you're going to run this through your machine the same you would as regular thread. So you have your spool of thread, and then you're going to have an empty bobbin, and we're going to wind this thread on the bobbin by hand. Now to wind the bobbin, you're just going to unwind your spool, and you can hold this or you could set it on your machine just so that it's not falling all over the place. You're going to take the end of your thread and you're just going to wind it around the bobbin. And you want to, it's a little bit hard to get started at first, but you'll just begin to wind it. And if you have a long tail, you can trim this part off. Then you'll just continue to wind the bobbin and just do it as systematically as you can. I've rotated that so that I can get an even roll, and I'm trying to just wind this bobbin carefully without pulling it. You don't want to stretch so that the tension is really tight. Just wind it on just as loosely as it's wound around the actual spool. So you'll just keep doing that, continue doing it, and you can rotate your bobbin so that you can wind down to both sides. Try to wrap all the way around so you go back and forth from end to end so that it's wound evenly. Now you can continue to wind the bobbin all the way and fill it so that you have it to use for future projects. But for one project, you probably don't have to fill the bobbin all the way, so it's up to you. I like to wind it all the way, and then I don't have to do it again the next time I'm ready to do an elastic shirring project. Okay, then once we're getting down to the end and we have our bobbin fully wound, I'm just going to clip this thread, and then we're going to take this over to the machine. Now for this technique, we are using a machine that has a bobbin that loads underneath. If you have a top loading bobbin, I'll share some tips for trying to do this technique on that type of machine. But I found that it's more consistent and you get a better result when you have a machine that has a bobbin that loads underneath. So we're just gonna switch out the bobbin that we have. This is our standard thread. And then we're just going to insert the hand-rolled bobbin in the exact same way that it's specified by your machine. So I'm pulling that in. I have it out right here. I'm going to put that back inside. And then I'm just going to catch that with my upper thread. So I'm holding my upper thread. It's going to loop around, and I'm going to pull that out. So if I just do that first part by hand, not on my first stitch, I'm sure to have both threads threaded properly, and I have a long tail to start with so that I can hold these threads when I begin the process. Now for this illustration, I have two types of fabric. I have a knit fabric that we'll show the technique on, and then I also have a very lightweight woven fabric. So I'll show you how the technique works on both types of fabric. For the woven cotton, I have the fabric prepped and cut. It's ready to go, and this top edge has a narrow 1/8 inch double turned hem. Now for the knit fabric, I've chosen just to press this under about 1/4 inch, and I'm going to catch my first row of stitching on this and not create a double turned hem. It's a little bit bulkier, so I think this technique is going to work better on the knit fabric. Another option could be to just leave the raw knit edge along the top edge of your shirring. Since it doesn't fray, it would gather in pretty tightly and still have a clean finished look. So now we're ready to start the technique on the fabric, and I'm going to start it just below my hemmed stitching line. I'm going to line that up with the edge of my foot right here. My needle is set in the center position, and I'm going to use this side of my foot to guide my stitching on every row so they're evenly spaced. So we're going to set this down. I'm going to move my stitch length to about a 4. Some people prefer to go all the way to the longest stitch of a 5 because it allows more elastic pull between each stitch, but I feel like a 4 is pretty good for the projects that I usually work with. Then you're just going to sew as you normally would. I'll have my needle in the down position because I'm going to turn my rows back and forth. And you can see already back here, after just a few stitches, I'm already getting quite a bit of elastic pull in there, and that's great. So we're just gonna continue sewing along those lines. Then I'm just gonna raise my foot. I'm gonna turn down. I'm actually just gonna stitch 1 stitch, and then I'm gonna turn, or I'll stitch 2 stitches, and then I'm gonna turn back and I'm gonna sew back in the opposite direction. Now I need to make sure that I hold this fabric straight and flat as I continue stitching my rows. So you can see that it's pulled in, but I do want to make sure that I hold that tight as I sew and I come back down. Now I mentioned before that I was going to use the outside of the foot for my line. I'm actually going to use this interior edge of my foot to guide against my prior stitching line. For doll projects, I like the stitching to be pretty close together. If you were gonna have farther apart lines, then you could use either the inside or the outside as your stitching guide. So now I've turned it back around, and then I have my stitching now on the inside edge on the opposite side. Alright, so here we have that elastic shirring, and that's been done. We have quite a few rows, and these rows are kind of uneven because it's a little bit hard to sew with the camera. But you can see here we've got a bunch of rows. That elastic bobbin is already doing its job. It's pulled this in quite a bit. So you can see this on the underside. These are the elastic stitching lines on the bottom, and then the thread lines are on the top. So now I'm just going to mist this with a little bit of water. I have a spray bottle, and I'm just going to spray that. So then we're just steaming that lightly. You can either use your spray bottle or your steam, and as you do that, it really will shrink up those elastic threads. And then you can press in your hemline. And then you have a very tight elastic shirring. And so that works really great for a bodice. This could be the front or back section of a dress. And then it's very stretchy. You could also do a whole entire skirt waistband with just a few rows. And now we're gonna do that same technique on the knit fabric. And for this one, I'm gonna hold these when I start my stitching. Now for this one, I'm using the thread on the outside of my stitching line. So I took 4 stitches down before I turned to loop back in the other direction. And I'm being careful to keep the fabric flat and smooth, but not stretch the actual fabric since knit also has stretch in it. I'm just keeping it smooth and flat to create the stitching line. All right, so here you can see the knit fabric stitched with that same technique. These rows have been stitched a little bit farther apart, but you can see the stitching line on one side, the bobbin elastic thread line on the other side, and then you can see here how we've just folded that and we did our first stitch along that line. So it's not quite as clean. We could have double turned that, or like I said, we could have left it just straight with this little edge creating a cut ruffle along the top. But for this illustration, this is how this looks on the back side, and then this is how this is on the front side. So you can see there's already quite a bit of stretch in here from just the stitching tension. But now we're just going to steam this slightly and you'll watch it shrink back just a little bit more. So just a little bit of steam, and it especially helps that top row. So this row up in the top, it really helps to shrink that in and create that top ruffle up at the top. It makes it very nice and tight. So you can see here we've got that all nicely shirred, so that's very stretchy. You have a lot of give in that, and it bounces back and holds its shape really well. And here you have both samples side by side. You can see how nicely this elastic shirring works on both woven fabrics and knit fabrics. All right, so that's it. I hope you guys were able to pick up the technique and you'll feel confident and comfortable using this moving forward. And again, if you have projects that you're working on, please jump over to the Facebook group and show us. We'd love to see what you're creating.